somewhere in the soft hills of southwestern Germany, in a region of dark pine and gentle rain called the Black Forest. A river begins so quietly that for centuries, people were not entirely sure where it actually started. Tonight, we will move slowly along that river, from this quiet beginning all the way to the sea, following its path through 10 countries, watching it grow from a trickle into one of the great waterways of the world. There is no need to remember any of it. You can simply listen and let the water carry you along. The river we are following is the Danube. In German, it is called the Donau. It is Europe's second longest river, after the Volga, and it is the only major river on the continent that flows from west to east across so many different lands. But none of that matters very much right now. What matters is the beginning, which is small and modest and easy to overlook. Near the town of Donaueschingen, there is a park with a clear, calm spring surrounded by stone. Some maps mark this as the official source of the Danube. The water here rises gently from the ground, cool and clear, pooling in a round basin before slipping out through a small channel. It is the kind of place you could walk past without noticing, if it were not for a small sign. For a long time, geographers debated whether this spring, or a nearby stream called the Breg, or another called the Brigach, was the true source. The Breg is technically longer, and by the strict rules of hydrology, it might be considered the actual beginning of the river. But local tradition has long favored the spring at Donaueschingen, and there is something fitting about that. Rivers, after all, are shaped as much by the stories people tell about them as by the water itself. Breg and the Brigach flow down from the wooded slopes of the Black Forest, through small valleys lined with fir trees, past farmhouses with steep roofs built to shed heavy snow. The region is quiet in the way that old forests are quiet, full of birdsong and the soft creak of branches, with narrow lanes that wind between villages that have changed very little in outward appearance for generations. Where the Breg and Brigach meet, just past Donaueschingen, the river takes on the name Danube for the first time. It is still narrow here. You could, if you wished, wade across it in many places without much difficulty. It moves without much drama, threading between low hills, gathering strength slowly, the way a person might ease into a long day rather than rushing into it. The Danube's early stretch through Germany is unhurried. It winds through the region of Baden-Württemberg, passing beneath old stone bridges and through small towns with church spires that have watched over the water for hundreds of years. In some places, particularly near a stretch known as the Danube Sinkhole, the river actually disappears underground for part of the year. The water seeps down through porous limestone beneath the riverbed and travels underground for many miles before resurfacing elsewhere, feeding a different river system entirely, one that eventually reaches the Rhine instead of the Black Sea. This happens only during drier months, when the flow is low enough for the ground to absorb it. It is one of the odd, quiet facts of the Danube's early life that, in a sense, part of it takes a completely different path to the sea than the rest. Moving further along, The river passes the town of Tuttlingen, then continues northeast before beginning a long curve that will eventually take it east across the whole of the continent. Along this stretch, the landscape is one of rolling farmland, gentle slopes covered in vineyards in places, and small industrial towns that grew up around the river's edge, because water has always meant transport and mills and life. The Danube here is still a regional river, important to the people who live along it, but not yet the grand waterway it will become. The city of Ulm marks an important point in this early journey. Ulm sits directly on the Danube, and its most famous landmark, the Ulm Minster, has the tallest church steeple in the world, rising more than 160 meters into the sky. From the top, on a clear day, it is said you can see all the way to the Alps. The city itself has a long history as a trading center, and in earlier centuries, boats called Ulmer Schachthelm, simple flat-bottomed vessels built cheaply and often abandoned or broken up for lumber after a single journey downstream, carried goods and emigrants from Ulm toward the Black Sea and beyond. Many people from this region, seeking new lives in the 18th and 19th centuries, floated away from Ulm on these modest boats, heading toward Hungary, or further still, toward the Balkans, becoming communities known in history as the Danube Swabians. It is a gentle kind of history, made of ordinary people moving slowly along moving water, looking for quieter, better lives elsewhere. Below Ulm, the river continues to widen. It picks up smaller tributaries, streams that drain from the northern edges of the Alps and from the hills of Bavaria, each one adding a little more volume, a little more weight to the current. The countryside opens up here into wide river valleys, dotted with small farms, orchards, and the occasional Baroque church tower rising above a cluster of red-roofed houses. In autumn, when the light is low and golden, this stretch of the river takes on a particular softness, the water reflecting the color of the sky, the fields on either side turning amber and brown. Further along still, the Danube reaches Regensburg, one of the best preserved medieval cities in Germany. Regensburg sits at the northernmost point of the Danube's course, the place where the river, after flowing generally eastward, curves and begins its long descent toward the southeast, a direction it will hold, broadly speaking, for the rest of its journey to the sea. The stone bridge at Regensburg, built in the 12th century, was for centuries considered an engineering marvel, one of the few permanent crossings of the Danube in the entire region. It was constructed using techniques that were, at the time, remarkably advanced, and it survived largely intact for nearly 800 years before more recent restoration work. Beneath its arches, the current moves steadily, patiently, the way it has moved for centuries, indifferent to the empires and kingdoms that have risen and fallen along its banks. Past Regensburg, the landscape begins to change again. The river cuts through a narrow, dramatic gorge known as the Danube Gorge, or Donauerbruch, where limestone cliffs rise steeply on either side and the water narrows and deepens. Within this gorge sits Weltenberg Abbey, a Benedictine monastery founded in the 7th century, one of the oldest monastic sites in Bavaria. The monks there have brewed beer for centuries, and the abbey's location, tucked into the cliffs with the river curling around it, has made it a place of quiet retreat for well over 1,000 years. Visitors have long traveled by small boat through the gorge to reach it, gliding beneath the cliffs in a silence broken only by birdsong and the soft sound of water against stone. From here, the Danube continues its unhurried path toward the city of Passau, which will be part of a later segment, sitting as it does almost exactly on the border between Germany and Austria. But for now, we can simply rest here, in this stretch of forested hills and quiet water, and take stock of how far the river has already come from its small beginning near Donaueschingen. It has grown from a spring you could step over to a wide, calm current capable of carrying boats and barges. And yet, in the full scope of its journey, it has traveled only a small fraction of the distance it will eventually cover. A journey of nearly 3,000 kilometers through 10 countries before it finally reaches the Black Sea. There is no need to hurry through any of this. The river certainly does not hurry. It simply moves day after day, night after night, carrying with it the quiet weight of centuries, the reflections of church spires and forest canopies, the slow accumulation of smaller streams joining together into something larger in the villages along its banks tonight. As for thousands of nights before, the water continues to flow past sleeping towns, past darkened windows, past the same stone bridges it has flowed beneath for centuries, moving steadily toward morning, toward Austria, toward everything that lies ahead. We will pick up the journey there in the next segment, as the Danube leaves Germany behind and enters the mountains and valleys of Austria. But for now, it is enough simply to have followed the river this far, from its quiet beginning in the Black Forest, through the old cities of Ulm and Regensburg, past the ancient abbey tucked into limestone cliffs, moving always gently toward the sea. The river we left drifting through the forests of Bavaria continues now toward a city built at the meeting point of 3 separate waters. Passau sits almost exactly on the border between Germany and Austria, and it is often called the city of 3 rivers, because here the Danube is joined by the Inn, flowing up from the Alps, and the smaller Ills, flowing down from the hills to the north. If you stand at the tip of land where the 3 rivers meet, you can actually see the different colors of the water for a short distance before they blend together. The pale green of the Inn, the darker tone of the Danube, the near black, tannin-stained water of the Ills, moving side by side before finally becoming one current. It is a quiet, almost meditative sight. 3 separate journeys folding gently into a single path forward. Interestingly, at Passau, the Inn actually carries more water than the Danube itself at their meeting point, which means that in the strictest hydrological sense, one could argue the river continuing onward is really the inn wearing the Danube's name. But rivers, like people, are often known by the names they carry rather than by strict technical measurement. And so the river continues eastward, still called the Danube, now considerably larger and slower, carrying the combined weight of all three waters. Just past Passau, the river crosses fully into Austria, entering a landscape that begins to feel noticeably different from the German countryside behind it. The hills grow steeper in places, the valleys narrower, and the towns along the banks take on the particular character of Austrian river settlements, with pastel-colored buildings, onion-domed church towers, and steep vineyard slopes rising directly from the water's edge. The Danube here begins to feel less like a regional river and more like the great artery of a much older world, one that has connected empires and kingdoms for centuries. One of the loveliest stretches of the entire river lies ahead, a narrow valley known as the Wachau, which begins near the town of Melk and extends about 30 kilometers downstream to Krems. The Wachau Valley has been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, prized for the way its landscape combines dramatic natural beauty with centuries of careful human cultivation. Steep terraced vineyards climb the hillsides on both banks, growing grapes that have been cultivated here since Roman times, producing wines that remain well regarded across Europe today. Ruined castles and watchtowers dot the ridgelines above the river, remnants of a time when this stretch of water was closely guarded, as it formed an important trade and military route between the eastern and western halves of the old Holy Roman Empire. At the western entrance to the Wachau stands Melk Abbey, a vast Baroque monastery perched on a rocky outcrop directly above the river. The abbey was founded in the 11th century, though the building visitors see today, with its golden domes and elaborate library, was largely constructed in the early 18th century. The library at Melk holds tens of thousands of historic volumes, housed beneath ornate frescoed ceilings, and the abbey's terrace offers a wide view down over the river as it curves away into the valley below. For centuries, travelers moving along the Danube would have seen this abbey rising above them, a landmark marking the beginning of one of the most beautiful stretches of the entire journey. Moving through the Wachau itself, the river narrows and slows, winding gently between the vineyard-covered hills. Small towns like Duenstein and Weissenkirchen line the banks, their houses painted in soft yellows and pale blues, their church towers catching the late afternoon light. Duenstein is perhaps best known for its ruined hilltop castle, where, according to long-standing tradition, King Richard, the Lionheart of England, was held captive in the late 12th century after a disagreement with the Duke of Austria during his return from the Crusades. The story, whether embellished by later storytellers or not, has become part of the valley's identity. One more layer added to a landscape already rich with centuries of quiet history. Beyond the Wachau, the river widens again as it approaches the city of Krems, and then continues eastward across the broad agricultural plains of Lower Austria. The landscape here softens, the dramatic hills giving way to open fields and gentle countryside. The river moving in slow, wide curves through a region that has long served as a breadbasket for the surrounding area. Small riverside towns continue to appear at intervals, each with its own quiet rhythm, its own church bells marking the hours, its own fishermen tending nets along the banks in the early morning stillness. Eventually, after this long, calm stretch, the river approaches Vienna, the capital of Austria and one of the great cities of European history. Vienna's relationship with the Danube is, in some ways, a study in careful management. For much of the city's early history, the Danube ran in multiple shifting channels through the area, prone to flooding and change. And the historic center of Vienna was actually built a short distance away from the main channel, along a smaller branch called the Danube Canal. It was only in the 19th century, after a series of devastating floods, that a major engineering project straightened and regulated the river's course, creating the single, controlled channel that flows through the city today, along with a separate flood relief channel called the New Danube, which now separates a long, narrow, artificial island called the Donauinsel from the rest of the city. This island, created as part of the flood control project, has become one of the most cherished public spaces in Vienna, stretching for more than 20 kilometers alongside the river, used by residents for walking, cycling, and quiet reflection along the water's edge. Elsewhere in the city, the Danube passes beneath the shadow of the Donauturm, a tall observation tower built in the 1960s and near the modern skyline of the Donau City Business District, a cluster of high-rise buildings that stands in quiet contrast to the historic Baroque center of Vienna, a short distance away. Vienna's history along the river stretches back much further than its modern engineering. Of course, the Romans established a military camp called Vindobona here, along the river's banks, as part of a chain of fortifications meant to mark and defend the empire's northern frontier. Traces of this Roman settlement can still be found beneath the modern city, layered under centuries of later building, a reminder that this stretch of the Danube has served as a boundary and a meeting point between different worlds for nearly 2,000 years. Later, Vienna grew into the seat of the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful royal families in European history, and the city's grand architecture, its palaces and opera houses and wide boulevards, reflect centuries of accumulated wealth and cultural ambition, much of it tied, in one way or another, to the river's role as a route for trade and communication across the continent. Today, if you walk along the Danube Canal in the old city center on a quiet evening, you can watch the water moving slowly past converted warehouses and old stone embankments, the lights of the city reflecting softly on its surface. It is a gentler, more intimate stretch of water than the main channel a short distance away, and it carries its own quiet sense of history, having served the city in one form or another since long before the more dramatic engineering projects of the modern era. As the river leaves Vienna behind, it continues eastward, the landscape opening once more into flat agricultural plains, the last of Austria's territory sliding past on either side. Somewhere ahead, though we need not rush to reach it tonight, the river will soon cross into Slovakia, marking the beginning of a new stretch, a new set of towns and histories, a new chapter in this same unbroken current. For now, it is enough to rest here, in the calm evening air along the Danube Canal, or perhaps out on the wide, quiet channel near the Donauinsel, watching the water continue on its steady, patient way toward the border, toward Bratislava, toward all the countries still to come. The river does not tire, and it does not hurry. It simply continues, the way it always has, carrying with it the reflected lights of one more city, one more evening, moving gently onward into the dark. Not long after leaving Vienna, the Danube crosses into Slovakia, and within a short distance, it passes directly through Bratislava, the country's capital. It is a curious fact of European geography that Bratislava lies closer to another country's capital, Vienna, than to any major city within its own borders. The two capitals, separated by only about 60 kilometers of river and plain. For much of history, this closeness meant that the two cities' fates were closely intertwined, bound together through centuries of shared rule under the Habsburg monarchy. When Bratislava was known by its German name, Pressburg, and served for a time as the coronation city of the Kingdom of Hungary, the Danube moves through Bratislava beneath the shadow of Bratislava Castle, a large white fortress set on a hill above the river. Its rectangular shape and four corner towers giving it a distinctive silhouette that has watched over this stretch of water for many centuries. Though the current building is largely a reconstruction completed in the 20th century, after long periods of decay following a fire in the 18th century. Below the castle, the river flows past the old town with its narrow cobbled streets and pastel townhouses, and past the more modern district on the opposite bank, where Soviet-era apartment blocks rise in long, quiet rows, a visible layer of the country's more recent history resting alongside its older architecture. Just downstream from the city center, the river passes beneath the SNP Bridge, an unusual structure completed in 1972, topped by a UFO-shaped observation deck and restaurant that has become, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the more recognizable landmarks along this stretch of the Danube. It offers a wide view back over the old town and the castle, and further out across the flat agricultural land that begins to spread out on both sides of the river as it continues eastward, past Bratislava the Danube enters a very different kind of landscape. Here, the river begins to divide into multiple channels, spreading out across a broad, flat floodplain in a way it has not done since its earliest stretches in Germany. This area, known as the Zhytny Ostrov, or Great Rye Island, is actually the largest river island in Europe, formed by the main channel of the Danube and a smaller side branch that splits off and rejoins many kilometers downstream. The island is a region of quiet farmland, its soil enriched over centuries by the mineral-rich sediment carried down from the mountains upstream, making it one of the most fertile agricultural areas in the whole of Slovakia. Fields of wheat and maize stretch out toward the horizon here, crossed occasionally by small irrigation channels drawing water from the river. And the pace of life along this stretch feels distinctly rural, shaped by the slow rhythms of planting and harvest rather than by trade or empire. This stretch of the river also marks the border between Slovakia and Hungary for a long distance, the water itself serving as the boundary line between the two countries, a role the Danube plays at several points along its journey. Small border towns sit quietly on either bank, their populations often mixed, with Hungarian and Slovak spoken interchangeably in shops and cafes. A reminder that political borders drawn on maps do not always match neatly with the lives of the people who live along them. Further downstream, the river reaches one of its most visually striking stretches, a place known as the Danube Bend. Here, after flowing generally eastward for much of its course through Slovakia, the river suddenly turns sharply southward, curving almost a full 90 degrees around the base of the Burserne and Visegrad hills before continuing on toward Budapest. Geologists believe this dramatic bend was shaped over a very long period of geological time, as the river cut its way around a resistant range of hills that it could not simply flow through, forcing the water instead to wind around the high ground in a wide, graceful arc. The town of Visegrad sits at the heart of this bend, its ruined hilltop citadel rising above the water, offering, on a clear day, a wide view over the curve of the river below. In the 14th century, Visegrad served as a royal seat, and it was here, in 1335, that the kings of Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia met for a series of political discussions that historians consider an early forerunner of later regional cooperation in Central Europe, a memory that has been revived in modern times through a political and cultural partnership among 4 Central European countries that still bears the town's name. A little further along, on the opposite bank, sits the town of Szentendre, known for its artist community and its collection of small museums and galleries tucked into narrow, winding streets. The town's character reflects a long history of settlement by Serbian merchants and craftsmen who moved north along the river in earlier centuries, bringing with them Orthodox churches whose domes and bell towers still rise above the rooftops today. A quiet reminder of how thoroughly this river has always connected different peoples and cultures across the centuries, long before modern borders were drawn. As the river completes its bend and begins flowing south once more, the landscape gradually shifts again, the wooded hills giving way to wider plains, the current slowing and broadening as it prepares to enter one of the great cities of its entire journey. Budapest lies not far ahead now, though we will save our time there for the next segment, allowing this quieter stretch of river, curving gently through the hills of northern Hungary, to close on its own unhurried note. For now, we can simply rest in this bend of the river, in the soft evening light over Visegrad, or in the quiet lanes of Szentendre, listening to the distant sound of church bells carried on the evening air, watching the water move steadily around the base of the hills, carrying with it, as it always has, the slow accumulation of centuries, the mingling of peoples and languages and histories, moving always, patiently, toward the south, toward the city that waits just beyond the bend. South of the Danube bend, the river straightens and widens, and before long it arrives at Budapest, the capital of Hungary, and one of the most celebrated stretches of the entire river's course. Budapest is, in a sense, two cities joined into one, a fact reflected directly in its name. On the western bank sits Buda, hilly and older, home to the royal palace and the winding medieval streets of the castle district. On the eastern bank sits Pest, flatter and more expansive, home to grand 19th century boulevards, the Hungarian Parliament building, and much of the city's commercial life. The two halves were, in fact, separate towns for centuries, along with a third settlement called Buda, and it was only in 1873 that they formally merged into the single city we know today. Before that unification, crossing the river here required ferries or temporary pontoon bridges, a slow and often unreliable process, especially during the spring floods when the current ran high and fast. The construction of the chain bridge, completed in 1849, changed this permanently. It was the first permanent bridge to connect Buda and Pest, an engineering achievement admired across Europe at the time, with its distinctive stone lions guarding each end, and its elegant suspension, designed spanning the water in a single graceful arc. The bridge was designed by the English engineer William Tierney Clark, and its construction is often credited with accelerating the eventual unification of the two cities, since it made regular movement between them, for the first time, genuinely easy. Today, several more bridges span the river through the city, each with its own character. The Liberty Bridge, painted a distinctive green and topped with ornamental bronze Tyrol birds, a mythical creature from Hungarian folklore, connects the southern edges of Buda and Pest. The Elizabeth Bridge, named for the beloved Habsburg empress known as Sissi, stretches in a single elegant white span across one of the narrower points of the river. Each bridge was rebuilt at least once in the 20th century, after German forces destroyed every bridge across the Danube in Budapest during their retreat near the end of the Second World War, an event that remains part of the city's memory, though it is remembered today more through the quiet dignity of reconstruction than through the details of the destruction itself. Rising above the western bank, the Buda Castle complex sits on a long hill overlooking the river, its origins dating back to the 13th century, when a royal residence was first built here, following the Mongol invasions that had devastated much of Hungary, and convinced its rulers of the need for stronger, more defensible fortifications. The castle has been destroyed and rebuilt many times across the centuries, shaped by Ottoman occupation, by Habsburg rule, by the sieges and wars that have periodically swept through this part of Europe. Each layer of history adding to the structure that stands today. From its terraces, the view extends across the river to the grand dome of the Hungarian Parliament building on the opposite bank, one of the largest legislative buildings in the world, completed in 1904 in an elaborate neo-Gothic style. Its facade lit softly at night so that it seems to glow gently above its own reflection in the water. Along the Pest embankment, not far from the Chain Bridge, a quiet and understated memorial called Shoes on the Danube bank sits directly at the water's edge. It consists of 60 pairs of iron shoes, cast in the style of footwear from the 1940s, arranged along the stone embankment, as if their owners had simply stepped out of them and walked into the river. The memorial honors Jewish residents of Budapest who were forced to remove their shoes before being shot at the river's edge by militia forces during the winter of 1944 and 1945. Their bodies then carried away by the current. It is a quiet, still place, more contemplative than dramatic, and visitors often leave small stones or candles among the iron shoes. A simple, gentle way of remembering a difficult chapter of the city's history without dwelling on its more painful details. Budapest's relationship with water extends beneath the surface as well. The city sits above a large network of natural thermal springs, heated by geological activity deep underground. And this has given rise to a long tradition of public bathhouses, some dating back to the period of Ottoman rule in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Széchenyi baths, with their grand yellow Baroque buildings and outdoor pools that remain warm even in winter, are among the largest thermal bath complexes in Europe. And on cold mornings, steam rises gently from the water's surface as bathers soak beneath a light dusting of snow. A scene that has become one of the enduring, peaceful images associated with the city. Margaret Island, a long, narrow park sitting in the middle of the Danube between Buda and Pest, offers another quiet retreat from the city's busier streets. Car traffic is largely restricted here, and the island is instead crossed by walking paths and cycling trails that wind beneath tall plane trees. past the ruins of a 13th century Dominican convent, where, according to tradition, a Hungarian princess named Margaret lived much of her life in religious devotion, giving the island its name. In the evenings, the island's paths are used by joggers and quiet walkers, the sound of the city fading into a low hum beyond the trees, the river moving softly along both shores. As the river continues south past the city's outer districts, the dense urban landscape gradually gives way once more to open countryside, flat and wide. Characteristic of the great Hungarian plain that stretches out across much of the country's interior. The pace of the water slows further here, the banks lined less by grand architecture and more by reed beds, willow trees, and the occasional small fishing village, where wooden boats are still pulled up onto muddy banks in the early morning, much as they have been for generations. Southern Hungary carries the river through a landscape of wide horizons and slow, meandering curves past towns like Kalocsa, known for growing paprika, the deep red spice that has become deeply associated with Hungarian cuisine. Its fields spreading out in neat rows on either side of the river during the warmer months. The pace of life here feels distinctly different from the grandeur of Budapest, quieter, more agricultural, shaped by the rhythms of the seasons rather than the ambitions of empires. Before long, the river will approach the southern edge of Hungary, nearing the point where it crosses into Croatia, beginning yet another stretch of its long journey. Though for now, it is enough simply to rest here, in the quiet plains south of Budapest, watching the reeds sway gently along the banks, the last light of the day fading slowly over the wide, calm water, the city and its bridges and its bathhouses now somewhere behind, its lights perhaps still glowing faintly against the darkening sky in the far distance upstream. Leaving the plains of southern Hungary, the Danube soon reaches the border with Croatia, and for a portion of this stretch, it also brushes briefly against Serbia, the three countries meeting in a quiet corner of farmland and slow-moving water. Croatia's relationship with the Danube is comparatively brief in terms of distance. Only a little more than 100 kilometers of the river's total length passes through Croatian territory. But this short stretch carries its own particular character, shaped in part by the region's more recent history, and in part by the older rhythms of village life along the water. Here, the Danube is joined by the Drava River, flowing in from the northwest, adding further volume to a current that is already, by this point in its journey, wide and unhurried. The confluence sits near the city of Osijek, the largest city in this part of Croatia, a place with a long and layered history shaped by Ottoman occupation, Habsburg rule, and more recently, the conflicts of the 1990s that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia. Osijek's old fortress district, known as Tvrda, was built in the 18th century in a distinctive Baroque style. Its buildings arranged around wide open squares that today host quiet cafes and slow evening strolls. Rather than the military garrisons, the fortress was originally designed to house. A short distance downstream sits the town of Vukovar, a place whose name is closely tied to the difficult events of the early 1990s, when the town endured a lengthy siege during the conflict that accompanied Croatia's move toward independence. The town was very heavily damaged during this period, and its rebuilding since has been a slow, careful process, undertaken with the same patience that characterizes so much of the river story. Today, Vukovar sits quietly on the water's edge, its Baroque water tower, damaged during the conflict, left partially unrestored and repurposed as a memorial and viewpoint, offering visitors a view out over the river and the wide plains beyond, a gentle reminder of resilience rather than a dwelling place for sorrow. We mention this once, briefly and factually, and move onward, the way the river itself continues to move onward past every town it touches, carrying forward but never lingering. Just past Vukovar, the Danube forms the border between Croatia and Serbia for a distance, the water dividing two countries whose modern relationship, like much of this region's history, remains something still being carefully rebuilt in the decades following the conflicts of the last century. Small fishing villages line both banks here, their populations often still connected by generations of shared history, despite the political line the river now represents. And in the quiet early mornings, small wooden boats can still be seen moving out onto the water, much as they always have. The fishermen aboard them paying little attention to which side of the current marks one country and which marks the other. The river continues southeast, and before long it enters Serbia more fully, leaving the Croatian and joint border stretches behind. The character of the landscape shifts again here. The flat Pannonian plain that has accompanied the river, since Hungary continuing to stretch out on either side. Though the hills of Fruška Gora rise gently to the north of the river as it approaches the city of Novi Sad, offering a change in the horizon after so many kilometers of flat farmland. Novi Sad, Serbia's second largest city, sits directly on the Danube, its old town centered around a wide, elegant square lined with Austro-Hungarian era buildings in soft pastel colors. A visible reminder that this region, too, was once part of the Habsburg territories before becoming part of Serbia and later Yugoslavia in the 20th century. Rising above the city on a rocky outcrop overlooking the river sits the Petrovaradin fortress, an enormous 18th century structure, sometimes called the Gibraltar of the Danube, built by the Habsburgs to guard this crucial stretch of the river against Ottoman advance. Its clock tower, with an unusual design in which the hour hand is longer than the minute hand, making it easier for river traffic to read the time from a distance, has become one of the city's most recognizable landmarks, visible for a considerable distance, both up and down the river. Beneath the fortress, an extensive network of underground tunnels and galleries, built over centuries for military purposes, stretches for many kilometers beneath the hillside, largely unused today, except by the occasional guided tour. A quiet subterranean counterpart to the calm activity on the water's surface above. The fortress and the old town across the river are connected by several bridges, rebuilt more than once over the 20th century after being damaged during periods of conflict, most recently in 1999. Though as with Vukovar, we note this briefly and factually before continuing onward, allowing the river's steady current to carry our attention forward rather than dwelling on any single difficult chapter. South of Novi Sad, the Danube continues its unhurried path across the Serbian plain, the current widening further, moving in slow, broad curves through farmland and scattered woodland, past small towns where the pace of life is measured by the rhythms of agriculture and the gentle passage of river traffic, mostly barges carrying grain or timber, moving slowly enough that from a distance they seem almost motionless, suspended on the water's calm surface. Before long, the river approaches Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, a city built at one of the most historically significant river confluences in all of Europe, where the Danube meets the Sava River flowing in from the west. We will spend more time there in the segment that follows. But for now, as the last light fades over the plains north of the city, it is enough to simply watch the water continue its steady course. The hills of Fruška Gora receding slowly behind, the fortress at Petrovaradin still catching the last traces of evening light on its pale stone walls. The current moving on, patient and unbroken, toward the meeting of two great rivers just ahead. Nights along this stretch of the Danube are quiet in a particular way, the wide plains offering little to interrupt the sound of water moving gently against the riverbank. The occasional call of a night bird carrying across the flat, open land. Small lights from distant farmhouses flicker here and there along the horizon, and the river itself, dark and broad beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, continues on exactly as it always has, indifferent to borders, indifferent to the centuries of history layered along its banks, simply moving steadily toward the capital that waits ahead, and beyond that, toward everything still to come. Belgrade rises above the Danube at one of the oldest continuously settled sites in Europe, a place people have chosen to live for many thousands of years, drawn by the natural advantages of a high, defensible bluff sitting directly above the point where the Danube and the Sava River flow together. The name Belgrade means White City, and the oldest part of the settlement, the Kalmigdan Fortress, has occupied this bluff in one form or another since at least the Celtic tribes who lived here well over 2,000 years ago, later expanded and rebuilt by Romans, Byzantines, Serbian medieval rulers, Ottomans, and Habsburgs. Each civilization adding its own layer to the fortifications that still stand today. From the walls of Kalemegdan, the view stretches out across the confluence itself, the pale, wide waters of the Sava merging gently with the greener current of the Danube, the two rivers running side by side for a short distance before fully blending into one another. A visible seam in the water that gradually fades the further downstream one looks. The fortress park surrounding the old walls is one of the largest and most beloved green spaces in the city. Its wide paths shaded by old trees, its terraces offering quiet benches where residents come in the evenings simply to sit and watch the water and the slow movement of barges passing below. Belgrade's long history as a contested borderland, sitting for centuries at the edge of competing empires, has left the city with a layered, sometimes weathered character, quite different from the more uniformly preserved historic centers found further upstream in Vienna or Budapest. Many of its buildings reflect a mix of architectural periods and styles. Ottoman-era mosques standing not far from Habsburg-style townhouses, Socialist-era apartment blocks rising alongside newer glass towers along the riverfront. This layering is not something to dwell on with any particular emphasis, simply a quiet fact of the city's long life at this crossroads of the continent, a place shaped gradually over centuries by the many different peoples who have called it home. Below the fortress, along the Sava's edge rather than the Danube's, sits a district known as Savamala, once a busy commercial river port, later fallen into a long period of quiet disuse, and more recently, the site of considerable redevelopment along the waterfront. A short distance further along the Danube itself, the district of Zemun retains a distinctly different character from the rest of the city, having developed for centuries as a separate town under Habsburg rule, directly across the river from Ottoman-controlled Belgrade. The two settlements facing each other for generations from opposite banks, before eventually growing into a single connected city in the modern era. Zemun's old quayside still carries something of this older, calmer atmosphere. Its narrow streets and small fishing harbor offering a quieter alternative to the busier center of Belgrade nearby. East of the city center, along the Danube itself rather than the Sava, a long stretch of houseboats known locally as Splavovi Line, the riverbank floating structures that have served various purposes over the decades, from simple fishing shelters to, in more recent years, restaurants and gathering places, bobbing gently on the current, tethered to the shore by ropes and small gangways. In the quiet hours of early morning, before the city fully wakes, these houseboats sit still and silent on the water, their reflections wavering slightly in the current, waiting for the day ahead. As the Danube leaves Belgrade behind, it continues eastward once more, carrying now the combined waters of the Sava as well, a noticeably larger and more powerful river than the one that entered the city. The landscape ahead grows increasingly dramatic as the river begins to approach a range of low mountains that will, in the segment ahead. Force it through one of the most spectacular natural passages of its entire journey. But for now, in this stretch just east of the city, the water moves through a quieter transitional landscape, past small riverside villages and wide stretches of farmland, the hills gradually beginning to rise higher on either bank as the current pushes on toward the Carpathian foothills waiting in the distance. Fishing remains an important part of daily life along this stretch of river, as it has been for centuries. And in the very early mornings, small wooden boats can still be seen moving out onto the water from villages along both banks, their occupants checking nets left overnight. The catch typically consisting of carp, pike, and catfish, some of which grow to a considerable size in these slow, nutrient-rich waters. The Danube here, and indeed for much of its course through Serbia, remains one of the richest freshwater fishing grounds in all of Europe, supporting both small-scale local fishing and larger commercial operations further downstream. The pace of the river through this stretch is unhurried, wide and calm, reflecting the low autumn or winter sky in a soft, pale gray on overcast days, or catching brilliant streaks of orange and pink during clear evening sunsets. The water so broad here that it takes on something of the quality of a lake, its surface only occasionally disturbed by the passage of a slow-moving barge or the quiet dip of a fishing net. Small monasteries, some dating back many centuries, sit tucked into the hills a short distance from the water in places, their bells occasionally carrying faintly across the open plain, adding a soft, distant note to the general quiet of the landscape. As night falls over this stretch of the river, the lights of Belgrade fade slowly behind, replaced by the scattered, isolated glow of small riverside villages, their lights reflecting in broken, wavering lines across the dark water. Ahead, though we will not reach it until later in our journey, the river is preparing to enter one of its most dramatic passages, a long gorge cut through the mountains where Serbia and Romania face each other across the narrowing current. But for now, in this calm, wide stretch just past the capital, there is nothing to do but rest in the steady, unhurried movement of the water, the quiet hum of a barge, engine somewhere in the far distance, the soft lapping of the current against the muddy banks, all of it settling gradually into the deepening quiet of the night. We will continue this journey in the segment ahead, following the river as it narrows and quickens through the dramatic gorge that lies between Serbia and Romania. But for now, it is enough simply to have followed the water this far, past the ancient walls of Kalemegdan, past the quiet, weathered layers of Belgrade's long history, past the fishing villages and floating houses along its banks, moving always onward, steadily, patiently, toward the mountains that wait ahead in the dark. East of Belgrade, the wide, calm plain that has accompanied the Danube for so many hundreds of kilometers finally begins to close in. As the river approaches the southern edge of the Carpathian Mountains and the northern edge of the Balkan Range, two mountain systems that meet almost directly at the river's path, leaving the water no choice but to cut directly through the high ground in a long, narrow gorge known as the Iron Gates. This stretch, extending roughly 130 kilometers, marks not only one of the most dramatic landscapes along the entire river, but also forms a natural border between Serbia and Romania, the two countries facing each other across the narrowing current for the length of the entire gorge. The Iron Gates Gorge is, in fact, a series of 4 smaller gorges connected by slightly wider basins, each with its own name and character, cut through limestone cliffs that in places rise almost vertically from the water's edge to heights of several hundred meters. Before the modern era of dam engineering, this stretch of the river was notoriously difficult and dangerous to navigate, filled with rapids, whirlpools, and submerged rock formations that had wrecked boats for centuries. Roman engineers, seeking to ease passage through the gorge nearly 2,000 years ago, carved a narrow road directly into the cliff face on the Serbian side, supported in places by wooden beams driven into holes cut in the rock, a feat of ancient engineering that allowed troops and supplies to move along the river, even where the water itself remained impassable to larger vessels. Traces of this ancient road, known as Trajan's Road after the Roman emperor who commissioned much of the work in the early 2nd century, can still be seen carved into the cliffs in places, though much of it was later flooded when the river's level was raised by modern dam construction in the 20th century. Nearby, a large stone tablet called the Tabula Traiana, carved directly into the rock face to commemorate the completion of the Roman road, still overlooks the water today, though its position relative to the current waterline has shifted somewhat since the dam projects altered the river's depth through this stretch. Perhaps the most striking human monument along this entire stretch of the Danube, however, dates not from antiquity, but from the late 20th century. Carved into the rock on the Romanian side of the gorge, a massive sculpture of the face of Decebalus, the last king of the Dacians, who once ruled this region before its conquest by Rome, rises more than 40 meters above the water. One of the tallest rock reliefs in all of Europe, completed in 2004, after over a decade of careful carving. It sits almost directly across the river from the ancient Roman tablet honoring Trajan, the emperor who eventually conquered Decebalus and his kingdom. A quiet, unplanned symmetry between two ancient adversaries, now facing each other permanently across the water, their images carved into the same cliffs that have watched over this gorge for millions of years. The gorge is also home to one of the largest hydroelectric projects on the entire river, a pair of dams known as the Iron Gate I and Iron Gate II, built jointly by Yugoslavia and Romania during the 1960s and 1970s. At the time, among the largest dam projects undertaken anywhere in Europe. These dams significantly raised the water level through the gorge, transforming what had once been a series of dangerous rapids into a calmer, deeper, more navigable stretch of river, while also submerging a number of small islands and villages that had existed along the banks for centuries, including the historic island settlement of Ada Kale, an Ottoman-era village whose population was relocated before the waters rose permanently over what had been their home. This is mentioned here only briefly, as a quiet fact of the river's long and changing relationship with the people who have lived along its banks, before we continue onward with the journey itself. Beyond the engineering, the gorge remains a place of considerable natural beauty. Its steep limestone cliffs, home to a range of wildlife not commonly found elsewhere along the river's course, including golden eagles and other birds of prey that nest on the high rock ledges, as well as several rare plant species that have adapted to the particular microclimate created by the deep, sheltered valley. On the Serbian side, much of this stretch falls within Đerdap National Park, the largest national park in Serbia, while the Romanian side is similarly protected within the Iron Gates Natural Park, both established in recognition of the gorge's unusual ecological and geological significance. Moving slowly through the gorge by boat, as travelers have done for centuries in one form or another, the cliffs rise steeply on both sides, the water taking on a deep, almost navy shade of blue-green in the gorge's shadowed sections. The current here noticeably calmer than it once was, thanks to the regulating effect of the dams downstream. Small villages occasionally appear tucked into narrow side valleys where smaller streams join the main river, their populations modest, their economies still shaped in part by fishing, though tourism has grown steadily in recent decades as more visitors come to see the gorge's dramatic scenery and its unusual mix of ancient and modern monuments. Toward the eastern end of the gorge, the cliffs gradually begin to lower, and the river widens once more as it emerges from the mountains into a broader, calmer landscape. The transition from dramatic gorge to open plain happening gradually rather than abruptly, the hills receding slowly on either side over a distance of many kilometers. By the time the Danube fully leaves the iron gates behind, it has grown considerably in both width and depth, carrying now the full accumulated volume of nearly its entire drainage basin. A wide, powerful, slow-moving river preparing to begin the longest single stretch of its entire course, the roughly 1,000 kilometers during which it will form the border, in various configurations, between Romania and its neighbors to the south, first Serbia, and soon Bulgaria. As evening settles over the gorge, the cliffs on either side darken first, their long shadows stretching across the water, even while the sky above remains lit with the soft colors of sunset. The river itself holding onto the light a little longer, glowing faintly gold and pink in its center, even as the surrounding mountains fade into silhouette. It is a quiet, contemplative place, shaped by millions of years of geological time and more recently, by centuries of human effort to move safely through it. From the carved Roman road to the modern hydroelectric dams, each generation leaving its own mark on this narrow passage between two ranges of ancient mountains. We will continue the journey in the segment ahead, following the river as it leaves the mountains fully behind and begins its long, steady course along the border between Romania and Bulgaria. But for now, it is enough simply to rest here, within the deep shadow of the gorge, watching the last light fade slowly from the cliffs above, the water below moving on, calm and unhurried, exactly as it has for longer than any human memory can reach. Leaving the iron gates behind, the Danube settles into the longest, uninterrupted stretch of its entire course, flowing for nearly 1,000 kilometers as the border between Romania to the north and Bulgaria to the south. This is a very different kind of landscape from the dramatic gorge that came before it, wide and flat, the river spreading out across a broad floodplain, its banks lined in many places by reed beds, willow groves, and low wetlands rather than towns or cities, at least for the earlier portion of this long, quiet stretch. The first significant settlement along this border section is Vidin, on the Bulgarian side, a town with a long history as a fortified river outpost. Its Baba Vita fortress, parts of which date back to the 10th century, standing directly on the water's edge. Its round medieval towers still largely intact after many centuries of use by successive rulers, from medieval Bulgarian czars to the Ottoman Empire, which held this stretch of the river for several hundred years. The fortress today sits quietly above the water, its stone walls weathered but sturdy, used now mainly as a cultural site and occasional venue for concerts rather than for its original defensive purpose. Across the river and a little further downstream, on the Romanian side, the landscape remains largely rural, small farming villages appearing at intervals along the banks, their economies still connected closely to the river through fishing, through agriculture on the fertile floodplain soil, and increasingly, in recent decades, through small-scale tourism centered on the river's wildlife and quiet natural beauty. This stretch of the Danube is home to significant wetland areas, remnants of a floodplain ecosystem that once extended much further before large sections were drained and converted to farmland during the 20th century. The remaining wetlands support a wide variety of bird life, including herons, egrets, and, in certain protected areas, pelicans, which nest here in some of the northernmost breeding colonies of their range in Europe. Further along, the river passes near the Bulgarian city of Ruse, the largest Bulgarian city on the Danube, and historically, one of the most important river ports in the entire Balkan region. Ruse developed rapidly during the 19th century under Ottoman rule, when it became a center for early industrialization in the region, home to the first railway built on Bulgarian territory, connecting the city to the Black Sea coast at Varna. A project completed in 1866 that was, at the time, a significant step in modernizing transport across this part of the Ottoman Empire. The city's architecture still reflects this period of rapid growth and outside influence, with elegant 19th century buildings in a distinctly Central European style, lining its central streets, giving Ruse a character quite different from many other Bulgarian cities, sometimes described locally as feeling more like a small Vienna than a typical Bulgarian town. Directly across the river from Ruse sits the Romanian city of Giurgiu, historically its close counterpart, and for a period during the Cold War, connected to Ruse by the Friendship Bridge, completed in 1954, which for several decades stood as the only permanent bridge crossing the entire Romanian-Bulgarian stretch of the Danube. Despite the border between the two countries running for hundreds of kilometers along the river, this scarcity of crossings shaped daily life along the border for generations, with communities on opposite banks, sometimes historically connected by trade, family ties, or simple proximity, separated by a river that, for long stretches, offered no easy way across. Continuing eastward, the river passes a series of quieter towns and villages on both banks, the landscape remaining largely agricultural and only lightly settled compared to the grander cities further upstream in Austria and Hungary. Small vineyards appear on some of the higher ground on the Bulgarian side, taking advantage of the warmer climate this far south and east, while on the Romanian side, wide fields of sunflowers turn slowly to follow the sun during the summer months, their bright yellow blooms stretching toward the horizon in neat, orderly rows before eventually being harvested for oil in early autumn. The city of Silistra, near the eastern end of the Romanian-Bulgarian border stretch, marks an important transition point in the river's journey. It was here, in antiquity, that the Roman frontier fortress of Durostorum once stood, one of the most important military bases along the empire's northern boundary, garrisoned for centuries by Roman legions, tasked with defending this stretch of the frontier against various groups from beyond the river. Traces of this ancient fortress remain beneath and around the modern city, discovered gradually through archaeological work over the past century, adding one more layer to the long history of settlement and military presence that has shaped this entire stretch of the Danube since ancient times. Not far past Silistra, the river reaches the point where Bulgaria's border with Romania finally ends, and the Danube becomes, for a brief final stretch, an entirely Romanian river once more, flowing now through the southeastern corner of the country as it approaches its final and most transformative chapter. The landscape here begins to flatten even further. The hills that have occasionally risen along the Bulgarian bank finally receding entirely, leaving a landscape of wide, open plains and increasingly extensive wetlands as the river prepares for its final approach toward the Black Sea. Throughout this long stretch along the Bulgarian border, the pace of the documentary, much like the pace of the river itself, has remained deliberately unhurried, moving through wetlands and small towns and old fortresses without any need to rush toward a dramatic conclusion. This is, in many ways, one of the quietest and most contemplative stretches of the entire journey. A river moving steadily through a landscape shaped as much by agriculture and quiet rural life as by the grander history found in the cities further upstream. The wetlands here, with their reed beds swaying gently in the evening breeze, and their scattered colonies of nesting birds, offer a different kind of beauty from the castles and cathedrals encountered earlier in the journey. A beauty rooted in stillness, in the slow rhythms of a floodplain that has existed largely undisturbed for a very long time. As night falls over this stretch of the river, the wetlands grow quieter still, the calls of water birds gradually fading, the reed beds barely stirring in the still evening air, the river itself, wide and dark, reflecting whatever light remains in the sky above. Ahead, though we need not hurry toward it, lies the delta, the final and most remarkable chapter of the Danube's long journey, where the river will finally divide into its many separate channels and, at last, meet the sea. We will follow that final chapter in the segments ahead, but for now, it is enough simply to rest here, in the quiet plains along the border, listening to the soft rustle of reeds in the dark, the steady, patient movement of water that has already traveled so very far, and still has, gently, a little further yet to go. Past Silistra, the Danube makes a notable change in direction, curving away from its long eastward path and turning gradually northward, tracing the eastern edge of the Wallachian plain before eventually bending east again toward the sea. This northward curve marks one of the last major shifts in the river's overall shape, a final large-scale adjustment in its course before it commits fully to its final approach toward the delta and the Black Sea beyond. This stretch of the river flows entirely within Romania, well away from the country's capital, Bucharest, which sits some distance inland, connected to the Danube not directly, but through a smaller tributary called the Arges, and in more recent decades, through a canal system built to allow limited water transport between the capital and the main river. Bucharest's relationship with the Danube has always been somewhat indirect in this way, the city having grown up instead along the smaller Dambavita River, though the Danube has remained, throughout the country's history, closely tied to Romania's economic and cultural identity as the great river running along its southern border, even for those living well inland from its banks. As the river continues its northward curve, it flows past a landscape that becomes increasingly shaped by wetlands and floodplain forest, remnants of a much larger natural floodplain that once extended across a considerable portion of southeastern Romania before extensive drainage and agricultural conversion during the 20th century altered much of the surrounding landscape. Even so, significant natural areas remain along this stretch, particularly around the Baltamica, Brele, a smaller floodplain nature reserve that has been protected in recent decades as an example of the kind of wetland habitat that once characterized much larger portions of the lower Danube before modern land management changed the landscape so significantly. The city of Calarasi sits along this stretch, a quiet Romanian town whose economy remains closely tied to agriculture and to the river itself, its port handling grain and other goods moved along the water much, as similar towns have done for centuries. Across the river, on the opposite bank, lies Bulgaria still for a short distance longer, before the border finally shifts, and the Danube becomes an entirely Romanian river for the whole of its remaining course to the sea, no longer marking the edge between two nations, but flowing now fully within a single country's territory, continuing north, and then gradually curving back toward the east. The river approaches two significant Romanian port cities that sit close together along this stretch, Brela and Galati, both historically important centers for river trade, and, in the case of Galati in particular, for shipbuilding, an industry that developed here specifically because of the city's advantageous position near the point where the Danube becomes navigable by larger seagoing vessels rather than only smaller river craft. Brela, a little upstream from Galati, developed over the centuries as a major grain port, its warehouses and grain elevators still visible along the waterfront today. Remnants of a period in the 19th and early 20th centuries when Romanian wheat moved down the Danube from the fertile plains further inland, was shipped from here to markets across Europe, making Brela for a time one of the most important grain exporting ports on the entire continent. Galati, a short distance further downstream, occupies a particularly significant position in the river's geography, sitting near the point where the character of the Danube begins to shift noticeably, the river widening further and slowing even more as it approaches sea level. The current here influenced not only by the water flowing down from thousands of kilometers upstream, but increasingly by the gentle pull of tides and by the changing salinity of water gradually mixing with the nearby sea. It is also near Galati that the Danube comes close to another significant waterway, the Prut River, which flows down from the north and forms much of the border between Romania and Moldova, before eventually joining the Danube a short distance downstream. Adding the waters of yet another country's landscape to the great accumulated current, Moldova's connection to the Danube, though brief in terms of actual riverbank, holds particular significance, as the country possesses only a very short stretch of direct access to the river itself, a small strip of land near the town of Giurgiulesti, allowing Moldova, despite being a landlocked country in most practical respects, a narrow but meaningful connection to international water transport, and through the Danube to the wider network of European waterways, and eventually the sea. This small stretch of riverbank, though modest in size, has taken on real economic importance for Moldova in recent years, as the country has worked to develop port facilities there to support its trade with the rest of Europe. As the river moves past Galati and continues its final approach toward the delta, the landscape becomes increasingly shaped by water in every direction, the boundary between land and river growing less distinct with each passing kilometer, wide channels and quiet backwaters beginning to branch off from the main current, foreshadowing the far more dramatic division of the river that lies just ahead, where the Danube will finally split into its several separate arms and begin its last, slow dissolution into the wetlands of the delta itself. The character of light and sound changes here too, in subtle ways, the air carrying a faint hint of salt from the sea, still many kilometers away, but increasingly present in the atmosphere. The wide, flat horizon broken occasionally by the tall shapes of cargo cranes at the ports, or by flocks of water birds moving in loose formation across the darkening evening sky, heading toward roosting sites in the wetlands that stretch out increasingly on either side of the river's main channel. Fishing boats here are joined increasingly by larger vessels, cargo ships and barges built for the open combination of river and sea travel that becomes possible along this final stretch. Their slow, steady progress adding a quiet, mechanical rhythm to the natural sounds of the wetlands around them. This stretch of river, quiet and transitional, marks the last calm interval before the true spectacle of the delta begins. There is a particular kind of stillness here, the sense of a very long journey nearing its conclusion, though nothing about the pace of the water suggests any hurry to arrive. The current continues exactly as it has for nearly 3,000 kilometers, patient, steady, entirely unconcerned with distance or destination, simply moving forward, the way it has moved forward through the Black Forest, through the mountains of Austria, through the plains of Hungary and Serbia and Romania, carrying with it, even now, the accumulated weight of every kilometer already traveled. In the segment ahead, we will follow the river into its final and most remarkable chapter, as it divides into the many separate channels of the Danube Delta, and at last reaches the sea. For now, though, it is enough to simply rest in this quiet, wide stretch near Galati, the scent of salt faint on the evening air, the wetlands stretching out on either side in the fading light, the water moving on, unhurried, patient, almost home. At last, after traveling nearly 3,000 kilometers from the small spring near Donaueschingen in the Black Forest, the Danube reaches the final chapter of its long journey, dividing into the many quiet channels of the Danube Delta, before finally releasing its water into the Black Sea. This is the youngest landscape the river has passed through in its entire course, still being actively shaped today by the same slow processes of sediment deposit and channel formation that created it in the first place. A place where the boundary between river and sea, and even between land and water more generally, remains soft and unfixed, changing gradually from year to year and season to season. The delta begins not far past Tulcea, a Romanian port city that sits at the point where the river first splits into its three principal arms. The northernmost of these, the Chilia Arm, carries the largest share of the Danube's total water and forms, for the whole of its length, the border between Romania and Ukraine, making it the only part of the delta not held entirely within Romanian territory. The Chilia Arm is also the youngest and most actively changing of the three main channels, still extending itself further out into the Black Sea through the ongoing deposit of sediment. Its own delta within the larger delta, growing gradually more complex with each passing decade. The central arm, called the Sulina Channel, is the shortest and most heavily engineered of the three, deepened and straightened over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, specifically to allow larger ships to pass through the delta and reach the sea by the most direct possible route, making it, today, the primary channel used for commercial navigation. The town of Sulina itself, sitting at the point where this channel finally meets the open sea, has a curious history as an international free port during the 19th century, when a commission of European powers oversaw its administration in order to guarantee free passage for ships of all nations, a legacy still visible today in the town's small, quiet cemetery, where gravestones in many different languages, English, Italian, Greek, Turkish, mark the resting places of sailors and officials from that earlier international era. The southernmost of the three principal arms, the Sfântu Gheorghe Channel, is the oldest and least altered by human engineering, winding in slow, natural curves through the delta's wetlands before reaching the sea near a small fishing village of the same name, a place that remains, even today, accessible mainly by boat, its population living a life still closely tied to fishing and to the rhythms of the surrounding wetland, largely unchanged by the passage of the modern world beyond. Between and around these three main channels lies an enormous, intricate network of smaller channels, lakes, reed marshes, and floating islands of vegetation, together forming one of the largest and best preserved wetland systems remaining anywhere in Europe. The delta covers an area of well over 4,000 square kilometers, the majority of it within Romania, with a smaller portion extending into Ukrainian territory along the northern edge of the Chilia Arm. In recognition of its exceptional ecological importance, the Danube Delta was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and much of its area is protected today as a biosphere reserve, one of the largest and most significant in Europe. The wildlife found within this landscape is extraordinarily rich, the delta serving as a crucial resting and breeding ground for an enormous variety of bird species, some resident year-round, others passing through during their long seasonal migrations between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Pelicans are perhaps the delta's most iconic residents. Both the Dalmatian pelican and the great white pelican nesting here in colonies that represent some of the most significant breeding populations of these species anywhere on the continent. Alongside the pelicans, the delta supports large populations of herons, egrets, cormorants, and countless other water birds, their calls and movements forming a constant, gentle presence across the wetlands, particularly in the early morning and at dusk, when the light is soft and the water especially still. Beneath the water's surface, the delta supports its own rich ecosystem as well, home to more than 100 species of fish, including several ancient species of sturgeon that have used the Danube and its delta as a migration route for millions of years, traveling far upstream to spawn before returning to the sea. A pattern of movement that predates not only human civilization, but the appearance of many other modern species entirely, connecting this quiet, gentle landscape to a span of time far longer than any of the human history recounted throughout this journey. The people who live within the delta today, in small villages scattered among the channels and reed beds, maintain a way of life shaped heavily by this watery landscape, many still relying on fishing as a primary occupation, moving between settlements primarily by small boat rather than by road, since roads remain scarce, and in many parts of the delta, entirely absent. Traditional wooden houses with thick reed-thatched roofs can still be found in some of the older villages, built using materials drawn directly from the surrounding wetlands. A quiet continuation of building traditions that stretch back many generations, adapted specifically to a landscape that floods regularly and requires structures able to accommodate the rhythm of rising and falling water levels throughout the year. As the three arms of the Danube finally release their water into the Black Sea, the transition happens gradually rather than abruptly. The fresh river water mixing slowly with the salt water of the sea over a considerable distance offshore, creating a visible plume that can, on quiet days, be seen extending some distance out into open water. A soft boundary rather than a sharp line, fitting for a river that has, throughout its entire course, so often blurred the boundaries between the countries and landscapes it has passed through. Beneath the surface, this mixing of fresh and salt water creates a particularly rich zone for marine life. Nutrients carried down from the entire vast Danube watershed, gathered from 10 countries and thousands of kilometers of tributaries, finally reaching the sea and supporting fish populations far beyond the immediate area of the delta itself. And so the journey that began so quietly at a small spring in the Black Forest, surrounded by dark pine trees and gentle German hills, comes finally to its end here, in the wide, soft light over the delta, the reed beds swaying gently in the sea breeze, the pelicans settling onto quiet lakes for the evening, the last of the river's water slipping finally and fully into the vast, dark expanse of the Black Sea beyond. It has been, across these 10 segments, a very long and very slow journey through the forests of Germany, the valleys of Austria, the plains of Slovakia and Hungary, the borderlands of Croatia and Serbia, the mountains of the Iron Gates, the wide agricultural stretches of Romania and Bulgaria, and finally, this remarkable delta, shared quietly between Romania and Ukraine, where the river at last dissolves into the sea. There's nothing more required of you now than simply to rest here, in this final, wide landscape, the water endlessly patient, endlessly unhurried, having carried across nearly 3,000 kilometers, and through the lands of 10 different countries, the accumulated weight of so many small streams, so many old cities, so many quiet villages, all of it now settling gently, softly, into the dark, calm water of the sea, exactly as it always has, night after night, for longer than any of us can fully imagine, and exactly as it will continue to do, long after this quiet story has ended, and long after you, too, have finally drifted off to sleep.